This is Tommy's Outdoors episode 21 with Paul Gleeson. Paul Gleeson is a big-time adventurer. This is the only way, this is the most accurate way in my head I can describe Paul. Topic of adventure was discussed many times on the podcast. Episode 14 springs into mind Wild Adventure Way and their CEO, Caroline Birch. Episode 12 with Kuba Standera, who was going to cycle through Sahara Desert to go fishing there, out of all the places. And obviously episode 16 with Thomas McIntyre, who cycled solo and unsupported across the United States. And this year he's gearing towards cycling across, or should I say, down the length of Africa. We discussed adventures many times, but I suppose out of all those adventures, Paul has probably the longest resume, and not only longest, but kind of like a biggest, most difficult, at least in my estimation, adventures or expeditions. So to name just a few, he cycled across the Australia. Then he crossed the Atlantic in a rowboat. Yep. Rowboat, crossed the Atlantic, and also he attempted to cross the Northwest Passage in the Canadian High Arctic, also on human power, rowboat again. So these are really like a monumental expeditions. At least this is how I feel about it. I am quite happy that Paul accepted the invitation to the podcast and is going to share with all of you stories from his adventures. And just before we go to the main podcast, please don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, whatever platform you're using for podcasts. We are there. So please subscribe and rate 5 stars. If you feel we don't deserve a 5 stars, leave a comment and tell us why. But if you think the podcast deserves 5 stars, go to the platform that you're using to listen to your podcast and rate us and leave the review. This is great help and really helps in development of the podcast. And also don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. You can find all the links to relevant social media on the website, tommysoutdoors.com. Okay, so now, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Gleeson. Paul Gleeson. Welcome to the show, and thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks for having me.
So, with us today, Paul Gleeson. We met earlier on some other occasion, and then you shared a story about your adventure. And so, obviously, today on that podcast, you're in a capacity of an adventurer, and you have a lot of adventures you can share with us. So this is what I'm saying. You're a TEDx speaker. There's a TEDx video on YouTube. You're talking about one of your adventures, and also on your website there's a number of things that you've been doing. So maybe it is, I'm just saying you're an adventurer, but maybe you want to introduce yourself in any different way to our listeners.
Yeah, well, look, I suppose we can all put different labels or different hats on ourselves, but if I was to maybe take a step back, probably for most of my adult life, I've been fascinated by us as humans and how the mind works and how we work and how some people can flourish, some people can get stuck at times, how we deal with setbacks, etc. So I suppose unbeknownst to myself, starting maybe 15 years ago, I started to maybe express that through doing different adventures. Mm-hmm. My training originally was in tax and finance.
Wow.
In the last decade or so, I've sort of transitioned into performance coaching, so working with individuals and working with teams in companies around sort of enhancing what we do and enjoying and being more engaged in what people do. And I suppose on the adventure side, like I started years ago, I decided to cycle across Australia. That was the first long distance trip, which was coast to coast from Perth to Sydney.
And it was like this solo, self-supported kind of
Yeah,
cycle.
it was. I was traveling with some friends. I was living in Australia at the time, and I got this idea that I wanted to do this, and then I thought, well, it's the challenge of it. You know, it was about a 5,000 kilometer trip, so I was the only one cycling. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, would I use it for something a little bit more purposeful than just me?
Yeah.
So contacted a charity in Australia and said, why don't I try and raise some money for you? I'm going to be doing this anyway. So, and I think probably again, maybe without being massively consciously aware of it at the time, I sort of always felt I've been very lucky in life. You know, I grew up here in Ireland. You know, I didn't want for anything. Great parents, great family. And I suppose maybe I'm aware there's a lot of people far less fortunate than I am. So decided to use the trip to raise some money. And when I did that, then I said, okay, I need to try and get maybe somebody to come with me, because if I'm on the bike 6, 7, 10, 12 hours a day, I'm not going to be really raising a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
So I put a sign up in a hostel in Melbourne where I was living. And somebody answered that, Tori, and then she came with me on the trip. So we raised a little bit of money for a 21-year-old Mitsubishi Sigma. That was the car. So I'd leave in the morning on the bike. Tori would stay in the town wherever we were and fundraise. Then in the evening time, she'd jump into the car and meet me
and catch you up on the
wherever I was. So it was sort of nearly not disheartening, but what, you know, it might take me 8 or 9 or 10 hours, you know, she'd do it in 2 or 1.5 or whatever, you know. So,
but in a car, it doesn't count.
Exactly. Yeah. So so that was, I think, that was the start of the adventure side.
And where were you staying overnight? Was it like always in a town or some in a village, or was it like a tent and then just a camp?
Yeah, I looked originally at camping and bringing tents and stuff, and then I thought, if I can, I saved up money to do it, so I had money just to pay for like little motels or B&Bs or in Australia, for any of your listeners, like in Australia, when you go across the Nullarbor Plain, so it's the you know, when you go east from Perth, after about 800 kilometers, so you'll come across the Nullarbor Plain. It runs right through, pretty much up into Adelaide. And it's a stretch where you really have nothing out there. So you'd have a roadhouse, which would be a petrol station, a restaurant, a pub and a shop, and then 200 kilometers of nothing, and then you have another roadhouse, and then another one. So that stretch of it,
there's like people living there.
People live there, yeah. So whoever's running the roadhouse,
are they like living there, or they just have a duty to run that roadhouse, and they're kind of stuck there for a couple of weeks, and then somebody changed, kind of like a lighthouse duty.
Yeah, it was interesting because someone asked me recently, did people look at you doing that think you were crazy? And I said, well, crazy is again, it's a very subjective thing. But I'd look at people who were living out here in the middle of nowhere, and they were basically working, running the shop or the pub or whatever, working in it. And I was fascinated to go, wow, like what brings you out here in the middle of nowhere? And I remember one day thinking, you know, one fellow I met, I was like, are you running from something? Or, you know, he was a bit of an odd individual. But so I was nearly more, I mean, for some of them, they actually said, I'm a country person, and you couldn't pay me enough to be in a city. So it was interesting. In one way, I might look at them and go, God, that's a bit different, living out here in the middle of nowhere. They could have looked at me living in a town going, you couldn't drag me there. So it's sort of that's what I love about these trips, is it's sort of, I suppose you meet people that you mightn't ordinarily meet, and because you're on a bike, you're going pretty slow.
Oh yes,
and
you have a time to absorb and observe and so on. And it also gets you out of your kind of like a template that you're in, and you think that everybody goes like in this routine, right? You go in the morning, you do something, and like this is how the life looks like. And then you go in and you see guys who are living and running roadhouse in Australia. It's like, oh, hang on a second.
Totally.
That's like not what I like. And they said like, well, how could you do anything else? Because they're in their own kind of frame of mind. And they like, well, this is all, you know, this is.
Yeah. I think that's the great thing with traveling and with getting a chance to do different adventure trips, is you do meet people. You just get exposure to different types of people, different walks of life. I love listening to people, so I love just hearing people's stories about where they've come from, what they've done, how they ended up here. Like I remember it was only 4 days into the cycle and I got hit by a car. And it wasn't like a car came past me at night time. It was I'll never forget, actually, it was the longest day of the trip. And it was, I think it was about 240 kilometers, and my knee was at me. I didn't really have my bike set. I changed my bike setup, and it was just sort of at me a bit. So I was going slower than what I might have ordinarily gone. And I'd say I can still feel the pain. I remember every maybe half an hour or so I pulled over in pain, so I strapped up my knee. And so it was probably about 7:30 when I was getting to the town. And I was just coming over the brow of a hill. I'd just gone over a hill, so it was dark, and I had lights on, but I could see the cars coming behind me because I'd see the lights and other beams ahead of me. And it just happened so quick. This guy came past me, and he must be doing, I don't know, they were all probably doing about 100 kilometers an hour or whatever it was, and he just smashed his side mirror onto my elbow, and then I just went into the ditch. So I jarred my knee a bit more, but I was fine. He hit me, I'd say, from his rear view mirror. Saw me going into the ditch, and he came back, and I never forget again, his hand was shaking. I think he probably thought he just killed me or something. So I was fine, but I couldn't. It took me nearly 10 days before I could leave. I tried to leave there twice on the bike, and I got like 10-15 kilometers, and my knee felt like it was about to pop. And if it was the last day or something, you might have just gone on with it, but because I pretty much the whole trip ahead of me, I went back and I got some physio. Eventually it was fine, good to go. But even just that, like, you get a chance to stay. This was in I think it was Norseman, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a mining town, and like you get to see just
like coal mining.
Yeah, it was could have been coal, copper, I think different minerals. And out in Western Australia, and you just got to meet people in the town, and people who were there for, like you mentioned earlier, some people would come in working in the mines for a month or two, in and out. So you just get to meet different people. So that was
that's a fun.
The physical challenge was definitely the appeal at the start with these trips, but then as you go through different ones, you realize there's a lot more to this than just the physical
that was
side.
something that you kind of discovered while you were in it.
Yeah,
so it was like, I'm gonna do this physical difficult thing, cycle across the Australia.
Yeah,
and then once you got into this, like, hang on, there's more into that, right?
Exactly, like everything we've just chatted about. And I realized as well that I got hit a second time. It was like the more went wrong on the trip, the more media coverage you'd get, which helped the charity raise money. So in a sort of a perverted way, like if you get, like, the last day of the trip, I was coming into, so Bondi Beach in Sydney was where I was going to finish, because I started on Cottesloe Beach in Perth, so I went for a swim. So the idea was, right, go for a swim in the Indian Ocean, get on the bike and go, and then finish the other side and go for a swim in the Pacific. So I was only 10, 15, I think it was about 10 kilometers from the end. So I'm coming in the Princess Highway from Sydney. It's 3 lanes or 4 lanes of traffic, and I'm over at the edge, and I just hear the screeching of a car brakes. And as I heard the screeches, I was just sort of midway going over my handlebars, and it was sort of a surreal thing, because I was like, have I been... Yeah, I think I've been hit. So I'm flying over the handlebars, and I put my hand out to sort of break my fall, and I'm not sure if I got knocked out, but I opened my eyes anyway, and there was people standing around me, and I was I ended up breaking my hand, but I've broken, I'm sure you have as well, if you've broken a lot of bones, you've adrenaline pumping through your system, so it's not really necessarily that sore.
Yes.
So I was like, I'll worry about that later. I had a couple of scrapes and stuff, but I rang the PR lady from the charity had arrived in from Melbourne, because we'd gotten a lot of coverage, and we'd raised a good few quid along the way. And I rang and said, look, I'm after getting hit, I'm fine, but the back wheel was totally scrunched up, so I said, I can't cycle it. So I said, I'll run the last 10 kilometers, because I didn't want it to finish on the side of a highway. She said, no, stay there, you, like, there's press and media and stuff, you have to come, you have to come in a bike. so I stay. I said, fair enough. She goes, I'll try and get a bike in a shop or something. So she went into a bike, explained the situation, and the guys in the bike shop had heard an interview I did that morning. So they said, here, you can have the bike, we won't charge you, like a rental bike. So she arrives with this bike. It was like an old hybrid mountain bike, and it was like, I'm not exactly that big, but it looked like I had stolen my little brother's bike. So I'm coming into Bondi Beach
big media coverage, and you're on that back.
But so these things happen, but that's all part of the experience as well. Stuff goes wrong invariably, and in a way, with some of the other stuff that I'm sure we'll get onto, it's nearly part of the attraction to go.
Yeah.
How am I gonna?
Especially now, once you know about this extra element that you just discovered in the first one, it's like, okay, I'm going to go to the next one. And what's going to happen there?
Yeah, and it's not like you don't, because people can talk about adventure trips, and adventure is somebody might decide to run a 5-kilometer run or a 10-kilometer run, and that could be a big adventure. It could be someone maybe who hasn't run before, or, just maybe a bit out of shape, hasn't been doing so for a while. And that's brilliant. And then you can have people who'll take it to another extreme where adventure might mean,
like yourself.
Well, yeah, and beyond, like beyond me. I know of people who would do things that, I wouldn't even consider. Like, I mean, it was, I can't remember his name. It was a French, is he French or French Canadian? He's a free soloist climber, and he just recently, last year, went up El Capitan.
Yes,
Alex.
This is like, I don't remember his name, but this is a big thing. The El Capitan. I remember I was it podcast, and then there was a movie about all the history, people who were climbing up El Capitan, and what was the time, and there was like a big culture of these rock climbers, and like and this guy, so he did it, Alex, I can't remember his second name, but he soloed it, so free solos, no ropes, no nothing, and he did it in like 4 hours. Like, no one has ever actually done this before, let alone do it so quickly. It used to take days with people who were camping on the side of spending night there and all that.
Exactly.
Well,
and
now it's hours.
And even that is phenomenal. So like, I think with adventure, depending on whatever level you want to bring it to or push it, I think part of it for me is that it needs to have, for me now at least, it has to have a little bit more meaning to it as to the why. And then also as well, I think is there's always a chance that you won't succeed. Now, for some people, maybe that guy, if he makes a mistake, he's dead. I mightn't bring it to that extreme. Well, I suppose maybe arguably sometimes, but sometimes I think with true adventure, you don't know if you're going to make it, and if something goes wrong.
It's interesting because a couple of episodes back on the podcast, I had a lady. She's running the company called Wild Adventure Way, I think, and they're kind of, their idea is to allow people to book the adventure, right? And we started like, hey, Caroline, what's the adventure? And she said the exact same thing. Anything that is like some unknown, like it might not happen. You might not be able to do it till the end. That's the adventure. And like you said, there's the one guy is going to be like a 5K run or 5K cycle, and he might not be able to do it. Yeah. Or something might happen. Or like I said, I'm gonna climb El Capitan with no ropes.
Exactly.
That also might not happen.
Yeah.
The consequences
to that. Yeah.
But that's actually very interesting that you kind of give the same definition of the adventure.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty about it, because it's not up to me or anyone else to go, oh, that's an adventure or that's not an adventure. It's great, whatever floats someone's boat. If they like doing whatever it is, adventure racing, climbing, rowing, it doesn't really matter. Like, I think it's nature is a good teacher.
Oh, absolutely. I have one more question about the Australia cycle. How did you? Was the dealing with dehydration and temperature an issue at all? Or because obviously that would be an issue if you go through the like completely interior and no roadhouses or anything, but you kind of were sticking to the kind of semi-civilized areas, I guess. Is that
all the roads. When I looked into doing this, the first thing I did was I went online to see who's done it. I'm presuming someone has done it before, and I remember I came across a website. And a guy had gone from Sydney to Perth, and I was reading his blog and stuff, and he was like, next time I decide to cycle across a continent, maybe check the prevailing winds. The prevailing winds would be more west to east. Right. So when I looked at it, it was all on paved, it was highway, it was road. Now when you say highway, a highway out there in the Nullarbor is, it's just a normal road. Like there's 2 lanes, one each way. Right. So it's
there's a tarmac on it.
Yeah, there's tarmac. Okay. So they're all tarmac roads.
There's like I picture in my head in Australia like an unpaved outback road.
Yeah. And you could. I mean, it'd be an interesting trip to do. Maybe to do something like that, but do it off road. On a trail bike. But it was probably, I did it in July, so it was their winter time. So it was still warm enough. But I'd say the tiredness, so I would have probably done maybe about 150-ish a day, 150 kilometers, and then take a day or two off for fundraising.
Okay.
So
So it wasn't like a day after day after day after day.
no, you do sometimes, like say going across to Nullarbor, you probably had 7 to 10 days of more or less 200 kilometers a day where you're just go because there's nothing in between. So it varied, and I also wanted to, it took me 60 days to do it. I probably lost about 2 weeks when I got hit the first time. But having said that, you could do it much quicker. So it just depends. Some people were like, oh, I want to break a record. I wanted to enjoy the experience too.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the thing was a bit of tiredness. My knee flared up. I remember cycling one day it was only for a couple of hours, but I was cycling with one leg because the other leg was killing me. So, or another day getting up out of bed, and I remember I had a bit of a cold, and I went out and it was just lashing rain, turned into hailstones. And I remember that day, like in the hailstones in Australia, they can be big enough, it's like little bullets that hit you. And I remember it was my sister's 30th birthday back in Ireland, and I was standing under a tree, and I rang her just to wish her happy birthday, and I think it was night time back home, and she's like, oh, how's everything going? I was like, oh, it's great. And like I was shivering in the middle of nowhere. So there's sort of moments like that where you're like,
convincing, like, yeah, it's great.
It's tough, and as well it's also, well, I've chosen to do that, so buck up and get on with it, like.
Exactly, because this is this thing, like satisfaction from overcoming the adversity. Right? This is what I'm doing this.
Yeah, exactly. And you do get a bit of I think I got a bit of a kick out of it, and sort of those sort of moments going, well, there's a part of me that comes alive in those situations. Not always, but I say probably not always. Like, if you're standing there shivering, you're freezing, it's not great. I suppose what I mean is that when you're out in the middle of nowhere, and I remember it's happened me a couple of times. I remember on the Atlantic trip, being underneath the boat, scraping barnacles. For whatever reason, I just remember it was a Tuesday, and I'm trying not to get myself hit by the boat as it's getting tossed around the swell, and I was like, oh, this is living. This is this is having a go. Regardless of what happens. So I think there's a part of that I like, but that's part of doing trips. I think.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned Atlantic trip. Is that now it's the right moment to talk about this?
Yeah.
Because this is really the story that I heard originally when we met, when we said that, and it's like, I must admit it was a surprise. Right, here we come, and you're just coming with this completely like a outlandish stuff, not outlandish, but like, wow, it's like, so you actually row a boat through the Atlantic Ocean, with your girlfriend at the time.
Yeah. So it was sort of, I was about to say it was one of those things. I don't know if it's one of those things, but it was actually after the Australian cycle. I had been living in Australia for a while, and I went travelling in different parts of the world after it, and I was back in Ireland maybe a year or so later, and there was a mate of mine was asking me about the Australian trip, and we were having a few beers one night chatting about it, and Shane said to me afterwards, he said, do you fancy rowing across the Atlantic? And just really casual, real matter of fact, and I said, that's interesting. But for some reason I was sort of intrigued by it, so we started to look into it, and at the time there was only 2 people in Ireland who had ever done it before, so we tracked them down. They were Eamon and Peter Kavanagh. They were 2 brothers, and they had done it about 7 years earlier. So we tracked them down, went out, met them, and fast forward maybe a couple of months, Shane decided for different reasons he wasn't going to do it. I had told my girlfriend Tori at the time, I told her about it, and her first reaction was, you're crazy. And
of course, that's a kind of understandable reaction.
Then I said, oh wait, no, it's a race, and there's teams from all over the world. And 10 minutes later she was like, oh, I think I'd like to do it too. So Shane had pulled out, so we said we'd do it. Originally we were trying to get a team of 4, because typically you'll do it in 2 or 4 or as a solo. So it was a race that started in the Canary Islands, off the coast of West Africa, and you go across the Atlantic, finish in the Caribbean. So we finished in Antigua. So it's about a little over 2,500 miles, and it's a simple enough idea in terms of, you have a 23-foot wooden rowing boat. They're ocean rowing boats, so there's a little cabin in it where you can sleep. You put everything you need for 2 to 3 months on it, and you have a water desalinator to take the salt out of the seawater. Everything's powered with little 12-volt battery.
Can you describe the boat a little bit more? Because when you say like, oh, it's a rowing boat, and then most people have in their head like a boat like you go out fishing.
Sure.
So
yeah.
that boat is actually suited for conditions in the ocean.
Yeah. Okay, so if you imagine, say a small sailboat. So if you picture maybe a 23 foot sailboat, and let's just cut the top. Let's take the cabin off. Let's take the mast, everything off. So you've your hull there, and you've got storage space below. So that's if you imagine that's the start of it. Then take maybe a 2-man tent and put that at the end of it, and that's your. It's all plywood, marine plywood.
Yeah,
that's your cabin. So you have a cabin in there where you can sleep, and then you've got 2 rowing stations. So again, just imagine, imagine like a rowing machine in a gym.
Yeah.
So it's a sliding seat setup.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you have two rowing stations, and even if you look at boats that people might see people out, in the Olympics or World Championships rowing, it's the same mechanism, as in it's a sliding seat, and it's sculling. So you have an oar in both hands. You have 2 oars.
Yeah.
And then it's a heavy boat, so you've probably got, it's probably 1.5 to 2 ton. When it's fully loaded.
Yes.
So you've got, we were talking about this before we started, that you try and plan for, okay, what's our sort of passage plan? What do we need on board? So you think of all your food, all your gear, your navigation, which was actually pretty, like it was a handheld GPS. Excuse me, some charts, your water desalinator, a backup one in case that stops working, which it did when we were out on the trip. Then you've got things like your sea anchor, which is like a big parachute, which
so it's called like a drift anchor. Or
it's slightly different. So the way you have little drogues. A drogue would look like sort of a windsock that you might see at an airport. Yeah. And you can use those. You can throw those off the back of the boat. Sometimes what they'll do is, if you imagine if you're getting hit by big swell, the most dangerous thing for you being out there is that if you end side up on the swell,
it kind of flip
you over. So you always want to be sort of perpendicular to the swell. Yeah. So in rough conditions where you're getting bounced around a bit, you might use a small drogue. You might use just even a thick line of rope that'll just help you keep your stern sort of in the swell. Yeah. So a sea anchor then is a much larger one, where if the conditions change and you're getting pushed backwards, so you physically can't row into some conditions, and the wind, if it changes, you're just getting pushed backwards. Yeah. So you throw a sea anchor out, it's like a big parachute, and what it does is, if you imagine you've got your boat in front of you here. You've got a 40-50 meter line coming off the edge of the sea anchor. So that goes into the water and it opens up. And when it opens up, water obviously rushes into it. So it's like an anchor. It holds you, because you can't use a traditional ground anchor, because at times you've 3, 4, 5, 6 kilometers. You're probably, I think it was up to about 5 kilometers deep. So you're you're not using an anchor there.
This is interesting, because this is pretty specialized design of the sea-going rowing boat. Yeah. Is there, how humanity came to developing rowing boat? Was it like it started as a sport, or is it rooted in some traditional fishing practices? Like how it came to be?
You mean this style of boat,
this type of boat? Like you wouldn't think like, oh, if you go in the ocean, you will go with a sailboat or whatever. So how it came to development of this type of the boat?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think if you go back to it was two Norwegian guys were actually the first to row across the Atlantic. This was I might get my dates wrong. It was the late 19th century. It could have been our early 20th century. George Samuelson, I think, and Harbo, I think, was the second. I can't remember. It's been a while since I looked at this, but they would have done it in an open rowing boat. So literally, it was like an open dory, I think, style boat. So this is like, forget about what we did. Like what these guys did was you'd no shelter. So
people were tougher back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. So they would have been the first people to do it. And then it was 1965 or 66 when a guy called Shea Blythe and John Ridgway were the first people of sort of modern day times, I believe, to actually do this. And again, they did it in an open dory where, you'd row in 2-hour shifts. So like you might, if we were doing it, say you might row 2 or 3 hours, I'll rest, then I row and you go. So you do that 24 hours a day. So you constantly want the boat moving. So like when they would have done it, I mean, you know, they would have probably just crawled under a bit of tarp and that was their shelter. And then I suppose in the late 80s, I think it was early to mid 80s, you know, it was actually Shea Blythe himself who would have set up what was called, I think it was called the Challenge business. And they organised the first transatlantic rowing race, which was in 97. So by that point, the evolution, I think, design had had moved on, that there was cabins were being built. The big thing with these boats is that they're designed to self-right.
Yes.
So if they flip, they'll come back. But there's a lot of instances and circumstances where they won't self-right. And that's where, you know, people have been killed doing it. Fortunately, not.
That's kind of a dangerous endeavor to go through the Atlantic, even on a sailboat. Not a rowing boat.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of you appreciate. I think for me anyway, I can't speak for anyone else. It humbles me because I realise how insignificant I am in terms of Mother Nature calls the shots. So if she wants to, I remember a friend of mine said to me when we finished it, said, "Oh, how does it feel like to have conquered the Atlantic?" And I said,
"It didn't feel like you conquered anything."
I didn't conquer anything. I said she let us pass, and she could take us at any moment if she wanted us. So, I suppose the design, to come back to your question, the design of the boats did evolve, and it still to this day even has evolved even more with positioning of cabins has changed and some.
But you sort of answered the question that this type of boat hasn't started and then evolved through the traditional practice that was aimed at keeping people alive. It was started as a sport/adventure endeavor from the very beginning. So those type of boats never had a practical use, if you like, or function.
Yeah, I think not really, because I mean, I think you're right. Like people would have used boats, safety boats, you know, when, like, I mean, if you go back to the likes of Tom Crean and the Antarctic and probably the greatest story of human survival that I've ever come across was their voyage in their little boats when they got trapped by the ice. So I mean, like it was probably never the smartest way to travel, but I suppose maybe it's human nature. We've a curiosity to, right, how can things be maybe pushed or you know, if you take something like, I don't know, take like an Ironman or a triathlon, you know, people swam before, people ran before, people cycled before, but you know, originally people cycled to get from A to B. They didn't do it to necessarily race each other, and
exactly,
you know, all that stuff evolves. So I suppose maybe human nature.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so we have a picture of the boats, right? And you have this idea that you're gonna row. So what went into the preparation of the entire
there was a lot. I suppose we were fortunate in that Eamon and Peter agreed to let us use their boat that they had used, you know, 7 or 8 years beforehand. It needed a bit of work and modification and updating and stuff, but that was a real help. And a large part of our prep was because a lot of people were telling us we were crazy and we were stupid and we were going to get killed.
There's always, you know, you always get that.
And look, I can to a point I can understand, because you know, up to this point I'd never rowed before. Now rowing isn't, you know, it's a relatively straightforward thing to pick up. I think the more I've done these sort of things, are not even just these things, even in life, if someone says, you're crazy or that's mad or stupid or whatever, that nearly serves for me as a good compass point to go, I could be onto something here. Yeah. So I think if someone says that, it's like, all right, maybe I'm sort of onto something here. So yeah, like we would have spent a lot of time with Eamon and Peter and just learning from them, trying to absorb as much as we could to learn from their experience. Then practically speaking, we would have done, you know, a sea survival course, first aid at sea.
Okay.
We did our shore-based yacht master course, which was learning how to navigate using the stars. So it was a really good experience because you had to sort of plan for, you have to sort of take full ownership for when you leave out there, even though it was a race. And in our year, there was 26 boats in the race, but pretty much within a day, You don't see anyone else because everyone's
Yeah.
going at a slightly different speed, a different heading. And when you're so low in the water, you can only see for a mile or two.
Oh, yeah.
So it was, I remember the boat was down in Arklow and we were living in Dublin, coming up and down to train. And then we got to a point probably about 6-7 months before we were due to leave. And we just needed to get the boat up to Dublin, but we didn't have a trailer. And like we were putting every penny we had into this, and we were obviously working full time. So we didn't have a trailer. We couldn't afford to buy one at the time. So we said, look, we'll just row it up. And so it was a 24-hour trip to row it up from Arklow. And it was really, when I think about it now, I think psychologically and even emotionally, that was the cutting of the umbilical cord, because up to then, every time we went down to Arklow, you know, Eamon might say, okay, we're going to stay in the river today, or it's a bit rougher, we're going to head out to sea, or we're not. So we didn't plan as much ourselves. Whereas for this, and Eamon was brilliant because he said, you know, I want you to put together a passage plan. How are you know, what do you need to bring? You think of everything. And even when we took the charts out, I'll never forget, there's, I don't know, is it maybe 10, 15 miles north of Arklow, there's a rock called Wolf Rock. And depending on when you go, sometimes it's exposed on the tide, sometimes it's not, obviously depending on the timing of the tide. So it was just things like that. He said, I want you guys to plan this.
Yeah.
Which we did. And I remember we were getting onto the boat and loading the gear up, and Eamon says to me, he says, oh yeah, he said, if you get into any trouble, you know, over the next, 24 hours, and you have to call for help, he says, you can forget about using this boat in the Atlantic. He says, if you can't navigate this stretch and make your way up to Dublin, he said, you've no business being in the Atlantic. So I remember my heart sort of sunk when he said it, and I was like, actually, no, take a minute, take a breath. He's absolutely right.
Yes.
And just own it and make sure you own it. So, you know, I remember, you know, we'd thought we'd no problems, but we got up the next day and I was absolutely knackered. And this was only after 24 hours. And like, you've got the excitement and the buzz of doing this because, it's our first time, and you're rowing at night time.
And were you rowing also in 2-hour shifts?
Yeah, we at the start we rowed together, and then we played around with shifts. But when we got into Dunleary, we were very lucky. There's a lovely man there called Hal Bleakley, and he had he'd given us a little berthing spot in Dunleary in the marina for the couple of months, and you know, at no cost, which was great. So when we rode in there and got off, and I was like, I'm pretty shattered. This is going to be one long race. So, and
again, where the race was, where the race was starting?
So it started in the Canary Islands. La Gomera is one of the Canary Islands.
How did you get the boat to Canary Islands?
So we shipped it out. Originally, we had ideas of, oh God, could we even row it out? And we were like,
that was in the back of my head. You also row it out there. Yeah,
it's strange because like the time flies really by, and in trips that I've organised since then, it's a bit like nearly cramming for an exam. You're doing as much as you can. You're trying to get maybe a couple of corporate sponsors to help with the funding. We were doing this we were doing for a charity to raise money for Concern. So you're trying to organise different events and stuff. So it's a lot. It's really full on, and in a way, it's nearly like when we shipped the boat out and we spent maybe 2 weeks out there beforehand, just with sort of last minute prep and stuff. But it's nearly a relief to go finally, you know, a year and a half later.
I know. This is what you often hear when you reading books about war, that the wars is this anticipation for soldiers going to combat and this fear and all that. Right, yeah. And once the gates open or whatever that is, and even if you're reading about the D-Day, once they in and you're going, it's a sense of relief. We're in it now.
We're
in it now. Now it's finally happening. So
that's because I remember thinking when we rowed out to all the teams were called out individually, and we're sort of bobbing around the harbour, and a gun goes off, and that's the start line. And I remember saying to Tori before we left, we're just sort of bobbing around, and I was like, I said, are you nervous? She's like, no, not really. Look at you. And I was like, no, I was just excited just to get going. And it was also nice to be around people, as in the other teams, who had gone through a lot of what we went through. And, you know, one of the hardest things was my family's reaction to it, which was I completely understood. They were just really against it. And I get that. I probably get it more now, being a few years older. But it was lovely to be around people who they were committed to this as well. And I can remember a conversation I had with Garrod. Garrod Towie was an Irish guy who was in another boat doing it beforehand. And it was weird the way sometimes you'd come across people not just criticizing you, but there was nearly a bit of venom in it or anger, and it's like, you know, and I've had more of this in subsequent trips. But I remember Gag said to me one day, he was like, at what point do people lose the ability to dream or to try stuff and just have a go? Like, and it was lovely just to be around. You're nearly around, I suppose, for want of a better word, fellow dreamers. And that was nice. But once you get going, then it's excitement. And you know, the first couple of, like, I mean, I was seasick after 3 hours, and I hadn't been seasick at all in training. And again, I was lucky
that sometimes happens.
We were really lucky. Like, I mean, Eamon and Peter said it to us that in the past, teams have, you know, someone gets sick, they pull the plug, they panic, and I'm done, I can't do it. So we were lucky with the lads, because they said, look, if it does happen, you might be sick for a few days, but it'll pass. And like those first, I think it was about 2 days where it was just, you know, getting sick, rowing, trying to get sleep, sick. It was horrible, but it did pass, and we knew, we knew it would.
It's fascinating because, like, again, like we had a quick chat before we started recording. I was saying in again a few episodes back, Thomas McIntyre was in the podcast who was cycled through the United States, and I was cycling through Africa, and the similarities what you're saying is like all going on, the obstacles, like the family not being happy and you're doing that, and then you think like, yeah, I'm onto something. It's like it's fascinating that the same pattern kind of repeats itself in that.
And I suppose it's tough. Like, I mean, I know with, like, if I think of the family side, where it's probably not like, I remember, I'll never forget, I asked family and friends, and Tori did the same for me, to put together a goodie bag of letters that we were going to bring. So I organised it for Tori, she did the same for me. And the premise of it was put out, like, if I asked Tori's family and friends, I said, write in it whatever you want, but the idea is that this is going to be a pick-me-up. So if Tori's having a bad day, I'll give her one of the letters, so you can say whatever you want in it. And I had, I looked at all of her letters. Oh God, that's a really good one, or that could be really good if we have a really bad day. And I remember I was having a bad day once.
Right. Did you read all those letters?
I would have read her ones before, like, so I wouldn't have read my ones, like, she would have had mine.
But you knew what she had in her.
Yeah, I sort of thought, well, God, if she's really having a bad day, this could be a great letter. Or
okay. So you get to choose which one is it for each occasion. How bad are you today? It's 8 out of 10. This letter for you.
Okay, we're going for the big one.
Exactly.
But my dad did a letter, and we subsequently wrote a book about this trip, and I remember I said, Dad, I'd like to put that letter in the book, because when we wrote the book, we tried to give as much as you can through a book to hopefully create an experience that someone feels like they're on the trip with you. And I had a couple of people say to me something, because, God, I felt like I was out there, which is exactly what we'd hoped we could do, as much as you can, through a book. And the letter was just so touching, and I read it, and it was very uplifting, and I broke down in tears when I read it. And I could get a sense how it was difficult for my family, because it's not normal for them maybe to support a child going out doing something that's potentially quite dangerous.
Rowing through the Atlantic.
Yeah, and I suppose I understood that. So the family thing is hard. And I remember saying to my parents at the time, I said, look, I would give my life for you, but I can't live it for you, and there's a difference there. And I think
that's nice quote, nice sentence. Yeah,
it's I don't know. I hope. I mean, like, I got married recently. I hope if Colette and I have kids, that I hope I sort of allow them the space and the freedom and the confidence to just go after whatever it is they want. And I'm sure
taking from
I'm sure it'll come. I know that it's going to come back at some point.
I heard that when you're becoming a father, it's like there are physical changes in your brain. You kind of like, physically stuff is changing in the brain. It functions differently. So.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the brain is so malleable that, I was just saying to you before, and I just finished a psychology degree, and it's so interesting actually learning more about the brain and how malleable it is, and how we can form new neural pathways in our brain, and when you talk about people changing habits and trying to change behaviors, and the brain has these synapses and these connections between neurons in our brain that you can form new ones. So the brain is so malleable. It's I've no doubt potentially, when a father, and probably even more so a mother, gives birth, there's a lot of things going on there.
Yeah. So we'll just wait for it.
Watch this space.
Exactly.
But yeah, I know I can definitely understand that, and in subsequent trips where I've done them with, people who have kids and the kids are at a school going age where, they can hear things from other people about their dad, say, who's going away on a trip. Oh, he's crazy and he's going to get killed. And, the kids might only be 6, 7, 8, old enough to know what's happening, but not necessarily, old enough to maybe have a full sense of how careful dad is being or whatever.
Yeah. So this is a good one, because I have a question now for you. There was recently, and I don't remember her name. I probably butchered the story, but I give a sentiment. There was a guy who was climbing mountains. I don't remember whether it was Mount Everest or whatever it was, right? And he got killed, right? And he got killed, and he was known for these adventure, extreme trips in the mountains and so on and so on. And obviously he ran out of luck. Unfortunately, passed away while doing this, and he left young wife and 2 young children, right? And obviously there was a lot of comments saying like, oh, he shouldn't be doing that. He's responsible now for the kids. He shouldn't be, go after that. He should and to be honest, I don't know. I wonder what you think about it, because one part is like, well, yes, you took on this big responsibility and you're responsible and you need to provide, for that family and so on and so on. On the other hand, obviously someone who does things like that, this is so deep in his soul, for want of a better description, that like, why would, like, is it okay for him to either not have the family because he does this thing, or give up something that clearly fuels him and drives him because of I kind of can understand both things. What's your take on that?
It's a really good question, and I suppose that I'd premise this by saying that everyone, like, life is, like, we all know life is so precious and it can be taken away from us in an instant. So I think we all have our own choice as to how we live life, and I don't think how I choose to live my life or how you choose to live your life, they might be different. I don't think there's a right or wrong, but I suppose my thought on that would be, if we play that out, actually what you've described, if we talk about that climber. Do you know that climber? No, I can't. I can't remember the name. I don't know. I haven't. I mean, I suppose climbers die regularly, but unfortunately.
No, I thought that because there was kind of like a big deal out of that, and I obviously don't remember. Anyway,
but if you sort of play that out, so if we take I'll give you a real life example, which is a teammate of mine, very good friend of mine, Kevin Vallely. Kevin is mid-50s now, and he's done adventures all over the world, and he did the trip that we might chat about later on through the Arctic, the first time I was up there. And Kevin has faced this question, and he, I can tell you sort of his insight on it as well in a second, but I can look at Kevin, I can go, this feeds his soul. He's an absolutely doting father. He loves his 2 girls to bits and his wife, and this brings him alive, and it's part of who he is as a human being.
Yeah.
So if I think of myself, I would be similar in that there's a part of my soul just comes alive being out here, and it doesn't have to be in the Atlantic. It could be, hiking up in the Dublin Mountains or something. Like
the challenge, the adventure.
I just love being outside, and there's a part of me that it's important. I think I'm a better human being when I'm incorporating this into my life. So if we play this out, and let's say, I'll use me as an example. So let's say if I did have kids right now, and I appreciate when you have kids, things probably change. Like it's probably, it's hard to do a what if.
Yeah.
But if I decide to never do any of that sort of stuff again, now I might decide to do that anyway. I might just go, right, I've enough of that and move on, and that's all cool. But let's say if I decide, I have kids now, I can't be doing that, and that's too risky. And there's a part of my soul, there's a part of my spirit that just goes. It's gone. So how am I with my kids? Am I the best version of myself around my kids, because I've let that part of me die out completely.
Yeah. You don't want to become like a bitter jerk in the house, in the family, because you cannot do all these things.
And then do you potentially then go, well, even it could be at a subconscious level, am I now harboring elements of resentment if I'm saying to myself, oh, I'm not going to do that because, and for I don't want to put myself at risk and my kids and my wife, etc. And that may be one option, and that can be, that could be okay, it could be fine. I would argue in that situation, your kids, your wife, the people you're around, they're not seeing the full you, they're not seeing the best of you. If you go around the other way then, and you look at someone maybe who does keep pursuing that to whatever extent, and when they're with their kids and when they're with their family, they're they're their full selves, and they're giving the kids everything. And if you ask me, I'd much prefer to have 50 years or 60 years at that versus 90 years of I let that one go, and I didn't go after that element. And does it come with risk if someone's a mountain climber? Yeah, absolutely. But I think if, I know Kevin has said this to me before, that he said, I would be a hypocrite if I'm saying to my daughters, go out, follow your dreams, live the life you want. And if I really want to do these things and I'm not, I'm a complete hypocrite. So, I think it's a choice everyone has to make. But that would be my take on it, my perspective. I don't think there's a right or wrong. And I think,
oh yeah, of course, like every circumstances and everything is different.
Yeah,
like each case is different. Okay, what's the book? What's the title of the book, and where listeners can buy it?
So the book, we published it in Ireland. That's good, a few years ago now. It was called Little Lady, One Man, Big Ocean. So that was published here in Ireland, and then when I moved, I spent 6-7 years in Canada. It was published in Canada under the title Crossing the Swell. So that's still the
same book.
Same book, yeah. So the first book, the Irish version, sort of we did one print run and sold out, and that was it. Whereas Crossing the Swell is still, you can get it on Amazon and stuff. So it's still there. Yeah,
we'll put the link to the book in the show notes. All right, very good, very good. Okay, so then I'm sure there was like a plenty of exciting stories while you were. How long it took to
the Atlantic?
Yeah,
it was 85 days.
85 days.
Yeah. So we had sort of originally.
That's actually quicker than I thought. I thought it was gonna
to be honest, we had originally thought we were aiming for around 60. We thought based on
really?
How fast we row. Okay. We thought if we get semi lucky, or if we don't get too battered by the weather, hopefully maybe about 2 months. Excuse me. But we did usually you from about June to October. It's now probably June to December is the hurricane season in the mid-Atlantic. Climate change has changed the patterns, relatively significantly now at this stage. So you get storms out of season or out. The season has changed nearly. Yeah. So you typically get about 12 to 15 tropical storms throughout the Atlantic in that part. So that's tropical storm is sort of 1 grade down from a hurricane. And out of those, you might get 6, 7, might be 6 to 8, 5 to 8. Say would go on to be full-blown hurricanes. The year that we did it, there was 31 tropical storms. I think there was 14 or 15 hurricanes. So it was in one way, when you're out in an ocean and you get 30, 40 foot swell, that's what happens out in an ocean. Like, it's not abnormal. And you'll get storms and stuff. And like, if we experience storms, which we have obviously in Ireland in recent times, we're on dry land. We're not out in an ocean, and it's obviously very different. But that's what happens. So we had hoped for 60 days. We got a lot of bad storms, and like I mentioned earlier, there was 26 boats in this race, and 9 went down at sea. So it was a tough year, and we just
went down. You mean like what happened to people? Were they killed or
mixture? Nobody died, thanks be to God. Nobody died. So boats capsized. Some boats literally got picked up by waves and smashed to pieces. So it was, it was various different. A couple of the boats were actually really close to Antigua at the finish when this happened. There was the boat I mentioned, the other Irish team. They were the first boat actually that went down, and I think we were 30 or 40 days into it. And their boat got picked up by a wave and it flipped, but it literally the cabin came sort of crashed onto the surface of the water and just smashed up into pieces.
And is that just bad luck, or is it like a mistake of operators?
No, it's luck. You need a lot of luck. I mean, the two guys, Gags and Kieran, extremely skilled. I mean, Grode was a former world champion rower, and he's been to a couple of Olympics. Like really, really good guys. They're solid, knew what they were doing. Just a little bit unlucky. They the way their boat was actually built, they had a drogue out, which I think was perfectly, normal and the thing to do in the situation they were in. I remember talking to them afterwards about it. And just by virtue of where the drogue was connected to the sides of the cabin, I think it might have been a slightly weaker point. But I mean, the boat was built, so it just meant when it pulled on the boat as it came over, it was pulling.
So they had this point. like I would do this thing differently, and maybe we wouldn't end up the way.
Well, I think to be fair for them, none of us are boat builders, so you wouldn't be necessarily aware of that. I think no, they didn't really do anything wrong per se. I think sometimes, I'll give you another example of one of the boats. A couple of the boats capsized, but they had hatches open. So if water floods into the hatches, if you have the hatch in the cabin open, which you often would because it'd be very hot, and water goes into it, then the boat isn't going to self-right. So when you get tired, and it's easy, I suppose
you make the little mistakes.
You make little mistakes, and they're understandable because you're hallucinating with sleep deprivation, you're tired, you're sore, you've been out there for months. You're pretty banged up at times. And I think when it's easy now, maybe in the comfort of where we're sitting, to go, I wonder, should someone have done something different? But when you're out there, it is tough to sometimes make the right calls. And I remember with that particular thing, as we got closer to Antigua, and we had a satellite phone with us, so we were getting text messages, and we knew boats had gone down. And I remember we just had this agreement that if you're in the cabin, the hatch stays closed. And if you were in it with the hatch closed, it was like a sauna. So when you finish your shift and you maybe just want to lie down, we said, okay, you can lie down on deck if you need to, but the hatch has to stay closed. Now you could, you knew if conditions were fine, but if it was just anyway picking up a bit, because I suppose we were benefiting from maybe having heard about what other people happened. So it's just things like that. If you make the best decision you can, and if you try and keep making, just err on the side of caution. Because outside looking in, it can appear crazy and like you guys are wild and you're nuts and blah blah blah. Whereas when you're actually in it, you're trying to make a series of good decisions.
Oh, you're very, very.
And you realize how exposed and how vulnerable you are. So there was definitely there was a few hairy moments, all right, when we'd one instance at night time, and I can still remember we had a little compass in front of us, so and there was a little light over it. And when you're rowing, you can't keep it on a certain heading, so you're trying to keep it maybe in a bit of a section. And by and large, if the ocean is pushing you whatever way, that's the way you're going. In a rowing boat. So we it was really rough and it was dark, no moon, and I remember it was raining. I was rowing. I was struggling even just to see. So the compass was only maybe a foot or two in front of me, and it was wild, and there was waves coming from different sides. And I remember that night. There's very few nights that we did. Sometimes if you're getting pushed backwards, you just have to throw the sea anchor out and say, look, we can't row into that. But your tolerance level for rough weather improved as you went on. So what week one, what might have seemed crazy was fine 2 or 3 weeks into it. But this night in particular, it was just, I said, God, this is just madness. So we battened down the hatches and, so you're getting tossed around. Like I said to someone recently, it's like being in a washing machine, but I've never been in a washing machine, so I don't know it's what I imagine it would be like. So we that was a night where I thought, just please let us get through tonight and I'll be very happy. So there was a few moments where things got a bit.
Have you guys come across any wildlife, any encounters with the marine wildlife, whales or?
Yeah, we did. I think we probably thought we'd have more. We had a couple of mako sharks. Very sort of brief. They were beside the boat for a little bit. We had about 3 days or 4 days before the end. A mate of mine had given me a little book with sort of pictures of marine life, and it just might be sort of cool if you see stuff, you might know what it is. And about 3 days or so before the end, I was rowing and really calm conditions, and I sort of look over, I'd say only 7 or 8 feet off to the side of the boat, and I see this massive whale, and it was just starting to sort of surface. It was a sperm whale, I think. And it just came right up, and it was bigger than the boat. Huge. And shout out Tori, two of us came out and we were just like, oh my God, this is amazing. And we just stood there for, I think it was probably only a couple of minutes, and it just drifted back behind us, came across the swell and just disappeared again. And we were so mesmerized by it. I didn't take one picture of it.
Yeah.
I remember that, which in a way I thought was sort of nice, because you stayed in the moment.
You focus on, yes, exactly, you experience rather than document.
And it was that was pretty cool. We saw sea turtle as well. So yeah, you had different bits of marine life. But
and you said that you were getting under the boat and kind of scraping off the what's the name of
the barnacles.
The barnacles.
Yeah. It's so with stuff like this, you'll get, because we're moving so slow. So we had anti-foul, which you'd put on the bottom of the boat to sort of stop barnacles from growing. Now, if you're around the coast, you could have that on. That could do you for a season. Whereas out there, I'm no expert, but I remember talking to someone about this, and the foul is quite strong, so you'll get barnacles will just attach themselves to the boat, and you're moving at quite slow speeds. And we knew this could happen, and I think the first week or two, I would have gone under a few times to check, and there was nothing there. And then as we got on, I'd say we were about 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks in, and we were going really slow, and it was killing us, because you'd be like, you might be doing a knot, a mile and a half an hour, and it's like, it's backbreaking stuff at times. And we sort of assumed it was because of the rough weather, and sometimes hard to even catch an oar, and it probably was to a point, but Tori noticed as the boat was bobbing around, it was like big wigs of barnacles attached to the side of the boat. So I went underneath, but we had gotten 2 text messages a couple of days beforehand about shark attacks, and that, boat 28 shark attack, crew okay.
How did shark attack the boat?
So we, at the time, that was as much info as I had. So I thought,
when the people were in the water.
No, they were on the boat, but like sometimes sharks would get curious and they might come a bit closer and they might sort of ram the boat. Okay. And this had happened apparently with one team, and they breached one of the sort of sections underneath in the hull. But they were all fine. But I'm no shark expert.
That's
but
surprising.
That's I haven't. That's what I knew at the time was right. So I remember I tied a rope around my leg, and I harnessed it onto the boat, and so you just take a deep breath, scrape, come back up, take another breath. I said, Tori, if you see anything with a fin, just pull the rope. So the first, I'd say 5-10 minutes of this, all I'm thinking of and all I have in my head is the Jaws music, and And do you remember in Jaws when he was coming, and you'd see fish scurrying away really fast, and of course underneath the boat there was loads of fish coming in, scurrying, picking off the barnacles and going away. So I'm paranoid. And after about 20 minutes or so, that was grand, that was okay. And I'd say 5-10 minutes later, Tori pulls the rope. So I was like, I nearly soiled myself. I was like, oh shit. Jumped up on the boat, on the deck, and I was like, where is it? I'm out of breath at this stage. And she points to a zebra fish that I'd say was about that size, like 6 inches. And she was like, there's no shark. I just wanted you to see the pretty fish. I swear to God, I nearly threw her in after me. God. So with the barnacles, it was amazing though. That was nearly a bit of a turning point for us, that our speeds improved. I'd say they nearly doubled, because the barnacles were creating a huge drag.
And even if you see like a racing yachts, this is the same problem.
Yeah.
So they also need to kind of make sure they maintain the
absolutely.
Right,
so it was that was, and then from then on I'd go under maybe every week or 10 days just to scrape off stuff. Yeah. But that was a fairly. You put all people talk about the marginal gains and the extra 1% and all that. I mean, that was a pretty big one for us.
It was 10%.
It was about 10%.
And what place did you guys finish?
We finished. We were 13th, I think, out of 26. Oh. And someone asked me that not too long ago, and they were like, "Oh, that's not bad." And I mean, we had
Did it really mattered at all? At the end,
it didn't. It really. I mean, nobody
Did you have this damn it, I thought we're gonna be third at least?
No.
Or was it doesn't matter, I'm just happy we're here?
It's interesting because at the start, there was, there was rowers in this race. Some of them had won. Like James Cracknell was he'd won like 2 or 3 gold medals in the Olympic Games. So we knew there was there was some high class rowers in this. Now that's all well and good if you're on a river. It's a bit different if you're on an ocean.
Yeah, and it's 80 days.
Yeah. Now that being said, obviously if someone has rowed to that level all their life, it's going to help. So originally all we wanted to do was to finish as high up as we could. And I'd say a couple of weeks into it, I remember, I think it was Tori's aunt was looking at other teams' websites, and she'd sent a couple of texts through saying, oh yeah, people don't even care about the race now. Everyone's really struggling, and it's like, holy shit. And that changed. I was like, for me, even leading up to that point, it was like, yeah, we want to finish as high up, but it's actually sort of irrelevant. Like, if you put 20 people in a room and, they've all rowed across the Atlantic, it's very few people will probably ask you, where'd you come? But we probably, to be honest with you, we probably came 13th because we finished ahead of a few teams, but 9 of the teams went down at sea. So I suppose we leapfrogged them anyway.
Oh yeah, that also counts.
By virtue of the fact that we finished.
Very good, very good. Paul, listen, when I heard that story for the first time, you told us at the time about an incident on the story. Would you be comfortable saying that? Do you think it's a right?
Yeah, about the other person. Yeah. So we were, I think I'm going to say about 50, 60 days into it, and when you're on a trip like this, it doesn't even have to be a trip this long, but with sleep deprivation, you can hallucinate. And you'll see things.
I'm surprised that you're in a state of sleep deprivation, because you have these 2 hours. So it's you have your how much 12
well, you've
hours.
Yeah. I think the reason and it's funny because I would have thought the same beforehand, and I think the reason is that if you finish a 2-hour shift,
you're not really sleeping.
You might not be sleeping, but so say you finish, you might be preparing food, or you're trying to fix something, or you're doing something.
Right.
But at night time, all you want to do is sleep. But by the time you maybe, if you get out of clothes, if you're soaking wet, maybe take the shorts off, you might get a quick bit of food, and then it might take you 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the other end just to wake up and get yourself ready, and off you go. You probably get maybe an hour and a half. So because of that, you're not really getting into a deep recovery sleep.
Yes.
It's very you're not fully recharging yourself. So it's I think we were...
You're not in a dream sleep.
Yeah, you're not getting into... you have what they call rapid eye movement or REM sleep, which is where your brain is actually still quite active, and you're reorganizing what you've... the brain is like filing stuff and sorting stuff. Yeah. And when you sleep as well, you've a cerebral spinal fluid is released in your brain, and it's like sort of a dishwasher. And it's washing away a lot of the toxins and stuff that build up in your brain during the day. So you've got your cognitive or your mental regeneration, and you've got your physical regeneration, which is that deeper, slower way of sleep. Yeah. So because of we weren't getting into that, and during the night time, so you'd have 3 shifts each, and you had about 12 hours of darkness. It would get dark at maybe sort of 6, 7ish. So the more the night went on, I always found it that, if you had that last shift, it was always the hardest. I found the graveyard shift, we used to call it. So we were I think it was about 4 in the morning one night, and it wasn't particularly rough. Myself and Tori swapped, and during the night when you swap it, you come into the cabin and the other person is going out, and how was it? It was grand, yeah. See you in 2 hours. There wasn't a whole lot of conversation because you're dog tired. Yeah. So I was about 20 minutes into a shift, and
it was dark.
It was dark, yeah. It was very dark.
And it wasn't cold.
It wasn't cold.
I was just trying to picture.
Yeah. If you imagine, it was dark, but there was a bit. I mean, you get some amazing like stars, and you're looking up at like
because you don't have a light pollution,
exactly.
So you actually see what you're supposed to see.
Oh, it's phenomenal. So you'd have some light from that. And it was a calm enough night. It was a warm enough night as well, and it wasn't particularly rough. And at night time you sort of get into this zone as well, where sometimes you might be listening to an audiobook or music, or sometimes nothing, and you hear the sounds of the oars to the water, and as you come through, you hear the oar locks and the gates just locking. So it was all fine, and I just got this eerie feeling out of nowhere that someone was standing behind me, and I got these pins and needles coming down my back, down my arms, and just like, oh God, that's a bit
We
strange.
all
So,
know that. Yeah.
you know, I was rowing away, and you know, as most people will know, or just you might necessarily think it. Obviously, you've got your back to where you're going when you're rowing. So I looked over my right shoulder. As strange as this sounds, sort of expecting to see someone. I look over, I don't see anyone. Then I look over my left shoulder, and I just see the lower body of a man. So, black pants, black dress shoes, probably 2 feet away from me. And the reason I mentioned hallucinating leading into this is I knew sometimes I was hallucinating and I was seeing things that were not real.
So you had this sort of conscious of like, okay, I know what's happening.
Like I remember seeing a dog on a skateboard one day coming across the swell in front of me. I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm not seeing a dog on a skateboard out here. That's not real. And your mind's playing tricks on you. So I this was different though. I looked at this and like I nearly shat myself. I was like, oh my God. So I look back and then I look away again and it's gone. And I start thinking, it's black. It's the Grim Reaper. We're going to go down because other boats have gone down. Okay, if we do, I should die first because I'm older. It's probably not fair. You know, and Tori, oh, what are my parents going to say? And you've all these crazy thoughts running through your mind. So I finished the 2-hour shift, go in. Tori's like, how was it? And I said, you're not going to believe this. And I told her what happened. And to this day, I will never forget the sight of her face was just in front of the electronic control panel. And the colour just washed off her face. And she was like, I don't believe you. And I was like, what? She's like, I had the exact same experience 2 hours earlier. But she didn't tell me. She was like, I didn't want to freak you out. So I was obviously completely happy to completely freak her out. And we sort of chatted about it and she went on and she did her shift. And it was something I sort of got comfortable with. I thought, oh, maybe it's... I don't have... At the time, I have probably stronger beliefs now, but I didn't necessarily spend a whole lot of time thinking what happens with the afterlife and is that the spirit of someone or what is that? And I remember when I came back and it happened to me a second time, a couple of weeks later, same type of thing. And I remember looking at, just researching online because we would have kept a log as to where we were, you know, latitude and longitude every day. And I remember thinking, I wonder, like, would we have been close to any shipwrecks or anything like that?
Yeah.
So I started just Googling and looking online and I came across, I think it was Lloyd shipping records. And we were a mile away from the last known location of a German U-boat the night that happened.
Right.
So I wondered,
was
it a spirit? Was it someone who had gone down? To be honest, I don't need to explain it. I don't know it was what it was. But it was just so real. And to this day, I'm convinced that's what I saw. And I started getting curious about this afterwards. And I remember I read a book called Third Man Factor. And it was a book talking about different people on different adventure trips over the years where in times of extreme difficulty or uncertainty or perhaps danger that they've experienced this third man, this third person presence.
Okay, so this is like a kind of known thing.
Yeah, apparently. I don't know how well it's known, but I remember reading about, I think actually it might have happened Shackleton or one of the men on one of Shackleton's trip down to Antarctica. And the explanation, I think, and I haven't looked into this in terms of the science of the brain, but whether we create a sort of a protective mechanism that we're creating someone who is another person or another presence to help us cope. Like when you look at something like, dissociative personality disorder or different things where you see, remember that film Fight Club, for example, years ago, and it was like, there was Jekyll and Hyde, there was another person. And sometimes if someone has a lot of early trauma in their childhood, it's a defense mechanism where this other person can be created. Now, so I don't know, was there a form of that going on out here? To be honest, I don't.
And
what's
like a let's say mainstream science position on that, or is it at all?
I don't know. You see, the thing about this is that if the brain is doing something, so if I was somebody who I created another personality, so if I had say DID, and it doesn't matter in a way how real or unreal that is to someone. If it's completely real to me, I'm living that life, and I'm there was a lady I read about, someone in the UK, and she had created, they estimate, between 20 and 100 different personalities. And this is what she was living through. And I think she could even still be alive today. And she lives, like, she's not dangerous. Like, she lives a life and she has some support or help. But even so much to the point where, you know, some of the personalities have bad eyesight. So literally she'll have glasses on when those personalities are coming out. So, I mean, this is to the extreme, obviously. Whether it was a bit of a coping mechanism, who knows? There's some people that would probably say, Paul, you didn't actually see that. That's not real. And it's just interesting because your senses, I know, you touched on earlier, like when you see a sky at nighttime and you're not surrounded by lights, it's absolute, and I'm sure loads of people have experienced it. You're out in the middle of an ocean and you've nothing, like you're 1,000 miles from land. It's amazing what you sort of see. And I know your senses, like your sense of smell is incredible. I remember we saw a sailboat and we talked it on the radio and it headed off. And I think before we even saw it, I thought I could smell chicken or I thought I could smell laundry. Like your senses get so sharp. That's
well known thing about that. And that goes even to, you know, someone said like on the sea, this is like an extreme level. And for example, that, you know, the smell of a human activity on the boat is so different than the smell of everything else. You can pick it up, but you even hear that from hunters who are going out and hiking in, you know, these doing these DIY hunt where they go out and hiking and essentially surviving in a number of days. It's like they can smell the animal. It's not like, and it's like, it's maybe it sounds stupid, but it's not only that you're glassing, you also kind of smell, because again, and I think that when you're out in the nature, you're kind of, your senses coming back alive into what it meant to be. And quite often we don't get to experience that because we're so bombarded by different you know, stimuli around where we are, and we have artificial light and all that thing. And now when you're all of a sudden out in the wild, your body's like, okay, it takes a couple of days, like, okay, this is how it's supposed to work. Right? And now you're experiencing something like, oh, have I just smelled that thing, right? You just never.
You've hit the nail on the head. Like it's interesting because like there's quite a lot of people who have no idea how good we're supposed to feel. Like if you think about what you've just said, like how overstimulated and, you know, maybe eating crap foods and not getting enough sleep and always connected and being plugged in. And I come across this in my work, and it's actually, well, that's a normality that has come about for a lot of people that isn't actually normal. It's a bit like that old you know, so when you think about the senses and what the senses are capable, and like there's still so much we don't know about the human brain and the mind. Like it's so there's things where, you know, if you go back to the likes of Freud and some of the stuff he was coming out with, which, you know, some of it then today, you know, like some of it was off the wall stuff, but I mean, he didn't have any science or he didn't have any, you know, neuroscience behind anything. And so I think sometimes we look for proof and we look for evidence of stuff, and obviously there's a place for that, and there's some, in a way I sort of like it that, you know, there's some stuff that we can't explain, and maybe we don't need to explain everything. And
I think that the mainstream science that I mentioned is really full of dogma sometimes, and kind of goes against the very basic scientific principle of questioning, right? Because science should question everything and assume that we're wrong. And there are some things that you just in a mainstream setting, you don't question that because you straight away get the label of, you know, this, that, or pseudoscience or whatever you are. This is kind of upsetting because there is so many other things to discover. You just keep an open mind and say, well, hang on a second, right? This is not
and your senses, as you said, like your sense of smell, your sense of creativity, your sense like how you're feeling, your thoughts. Like it's amazing with these sort of trips as well, as you rightly say, a lot of these senses come alive when we're away from, you know, the day to day that a lot of us live in.
We have an opportunity to actually acknowledge them.
And it's just, I think, like even just a really simple thing, you know, and this is actually some of the science, there's a lot of neuroscience behind this, but our brains, if I said to you, tell me environments where we're very innovative, we're very, you know, we can harness innovation and we come up with things. Neuroscience now tells us outside, in motion, near water. 3 things as an example. And this came up recently, and I know I get it often. I could be out on the bike, or I'm out, you know, hiking or whatever it is I'm doing, or out in the kayak, and I'll get ideas. I get stuff. I'm not even trying to.
Absolutely.
I'm not even trying to.
They coming.
They just come. It's interesting. I was with a client I was working with a couple of months ago, and we were talking about this, and I said, so what about for you guys? There was about maybe 30, 40 people in the room. The session that I was facilitating, I said, where do you get, like, when you're innovative, tell me what's going on, what's the circumstance, where are you, what are you doing? And the CEO put his hand up. He's a really cool guy, an Australian fella. He says, I don't want to freak anyone out, but it often happens for me in the shower. And you get good ideas. Now, I hadn't said anything about but I've just said to you about being outside in fresh air. Yeah. And they were just giving me all different ideas and where it happens for them. And then I just shared that one point with them. I said, well, there's 3 areas: outside, in motion, near water. And it's things like that sometimes we can go counterintuitive to that. We can say, okay, we're going to put people in the room there. Guys, we need to come up with some good ideas. And
be innovative now.
There you go. Whereas if we were to sort of work with the body and work with the mind to give ourselves the best chance of it, sometimes it's not even at work. It's like that, well, there's a half a day, go for a hike there. Like I do a lot of coaching sessions and stuff where we're outside. Because if obviously the weather permits it and you're fresh air, you're walking. So it's
like you said, there's the neuroscience behind that, how the brain works and how the various parts are switching on and off, and then they can go about doing their own thing, and that's where the idea is coming from.
Because one of the myths, I suppose, and I'll consider myself for the rest of my life a student of this, but of the mind, is that there's this sort of myth that a certain part of the brain does a certain thing, whereas there's if you take, say, your amygdala as an example, small little part in the center of your brain, your limbic system, and it does a lot of your emotional processing and regulation. So a lot of people might say, oh, it's the amygdala, that's the emotional, that's the limbic system, and it plays a big role, but other parts are involved as well. So with the innovation piece, one of the things that happens when often we come up with good ideas is a thing called sensory gating, where your mind is do you ever find that point where you could be driving home, or you could be out for a run, and you sort of nearly lose track of, you arrive home and all of a sudden, where did that,
especially like when you're cycling and it's like, have I already passed that point on the way back? Or is it still like, and this is the road that you cycle, like hundreds of times, and all of a sudden you kind of like, again, that's something that we already spoke on the podcast, like a state of flow, like a state of meditation, where you
flow state,
it's like, what's where am I, what happened,
and you've just a lot of your sort of your sensory receptors even they've just sort of dialed down a bit, so you're just sort of you're not necessarily thinking, or you're not distracted, and that's one of the circumstances that can contribute to coming up and being sort of more innovative. So it's it's fascinating that here we are talking now, we got onto this, but here we are, it's all good.
That's good. Listen, any final thoughts on the Atlantic trip?
I don't know, I think one of the things that, and this is life experience, I think it doesn't matter if it's the Atlantic or anything else, but I remember coming off the Atlantic, and I think actually my dad might have said it to me, that you've changed a bit. The person, I think it was my dad, I said like, the person who left the Atlantic and who embarked and who left the Canary Islands, that person didn't come back. In that,
no doubt, I'm not surprised.
Not that you don't completely change or anything, but you sort of evolve, and it definitely, for me, it because you've so much time out there to think about things in your life that you've enjoyed, what you might want to do, stuff you might want to change, because you're totally uninterrupted. And I think for me, that was one thing. It challenged my own perception of, I think, how I want to live life and what's possible, what isn't possible. So I think in a healthy way, it just shook up some of my perspectives, which I think isn't a bad thing, And you mentioned it earlier, the curiosity and the openness to learn and to experience stuff. I think that definitely shifted to the point where, I think I've always had this in me, but if someone says something can't be done, and I grew up with mom always telling me there's no such thing as can't. And I think I just instinctively now, and it's been sort of reinforced, I think, by the Atlantic trip, to go, well, why can't it? Maybe we just haven't figured out how to do it yet. But, maybe I can't do it, but you could, or, it's, I suppose I'm probably a lot more curiously questioning things now. Even for, from a work perspective, to go, okay, it's it's fine doing some of the work, but me as, you know, a performance coach or a consultant right now, where I need to be in a year and 2 years and 3 years, I need to continuously up my game, because the version of me now, in my opinion, it needs to be more evolved. It needs to improve so that you're coming up with more innovative ways to work with people. And it's not being innovative for the sake of it, but it's going, so what can I do, or what pieces of, whether it's science or whether it's experiences or bringing people out on retreats, whatever it might be, what can I incorporate into what I do to make that experience better, so that if I'm working with someone, they're going to take more away from that.
Yeah.
So that's, I think that shifted a bit for me after the Atlantic trip.
Great. Okay, I just want to quickly touch on some other of your adventures. We don't have enough time to speak about everything, but then your Arctic trip.
Yeah, that was so that was a trip where it was I was living in Canada, so I was living in Vancouver over on the west coast of Canada, and it was a trip that myself.
How many years after was it?
This would have been 5. No, it was 2014. 2013 was the Arctic trip, and 2006 was the Atlantic trip. So, so it was a few years after. I'd done a couple of small things in between, but.
And have you been like thinking like, damn, I need to get into that zone again? Was that something?
No, do you know what the funny thing is? I think these things just sort of seem to happen, as in, you know, the way you could be walking down the road, you could be doing anything, and there's probably opportunities and choices and different things all around us every day, but depending on where we are in ourselves, we may see those opportunities or we may not. And I think for me, I wasn't running around going, God, what's the next thing? It sort of happened organically. And I think if I'm in a sort of a good place, I'm more likely to go, oh God, that's interesting. So like I was asked to speak at an adventure show, and it was like a sort of
so it wasn't like an itch that you had to scratch.
No, I think maybe subconsciously it was there going. I'd done a couple of smaller sort of cycling stuff in between, and maybe without me consciously being aware of it, I was, I was on the prowl for something. But it was an event called Feet. It was a really cool event actually. You had about 8 or 9 people speaking for. I think it was 7 or 8 minutes each, and there was some adventure people there who'd done other trips, and Kevin, who I mentioned earlier, Kevin Vallely, he was there speaking, I think, before me, and we all arrived to the theatre where it was on at 4 or 5 o'clock, and went through sort of prep stuff, and then the show started at whatever 7 o'clock, 8. So we're all chatting away beforehand, and Kevin held the record for the fastest trip at the time to the South Pole.
Wow.
So he was talking about loads of different trips he'd done, and this was one of them. And Kevin's parents are from Limerick, where I'm from. So we ended up just sort of chatting, and over the course of the night, because Antarctica, I was in Antarctica years ago, but I was just, the whole thing of the South Pole was, it was sort of in the back of my mind. So myself and Kev arranged to meet for a coffee a week or 2 later, and I wanted to pick his brain on the South Pole, and what I didn't realise is he wanted to pick my brain because he had been thinking about rowing or trying to go through the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic. So no one had ever done it. So again, just for I suppose people listening, so the Northwest Passage, if you look at a map of Canada and go north, so if you go west, go to Vancouver on the west coast and keep going north until you run out of land, the Northwest Passage connects the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, so it runs right through the Canadian archipelago up in the high Arctic. So that was, no one had ever managed to do that in one season on human power, and primarily because probably up to 10-15 years ago it was choked with ice year round.
Yes. Is that the passage that just recently opened up for the first time?
Well,
because of the
it's
climate,
basically with the warming of the climate now, and with climate change as a whole, you now get maybe a 2 to 3 month window where the ice will break up and it's navigable. So that's probably one of the main reasons why someone hadn't done it, I'd say, before. And look, it might not be on everyone's radar to do anyway. So Kev was asking me about this, and I started chat. I honestly,
rower.
Well, he was like, could the boat that you used, would that be maybe suitable for up here? And half an hour into it, I was like, God, this could be really interesting. And he said, I've been thinking about this for Kev had this idea probably 10 years earlier.
Oh, wow.
So he's like, it's one of the last firsts
Yes.
that has yet to be done, and somebody will do it at some point. So he was like, what do you think? And I was like, yeah, geez, that sounds interesting. And so we left, and I walked out of there, hand on heart, honestly going, I'm not too sure where the Northwest Passage is. I didn't want to say it to Kev, like, so where exactly is? I knew it was up somewhere in the Arctic. So I started looking at Googling it, and I think it was just before Christmas. I was coming back to Ireland for Christmas. Got back to Vancouver after Christmas, and I rang Kev and I said, let's do it, if you're up for it. So that was the start of it. And it was interesting. So Kevin has written a book about that trip, which was only published in the last couple of months.
Okay.
And he actually, because he sent me a proof to sort of read some of it beforehand. And his perception of what happened there was that I walked away. And he was like, yeah, I'm not sure if Paul was altogether that interested. And that's what Kev sort of, that's how it landed with him. Whereas I think I was probably going, right, I need to just find out a little bit more about this. But it was similar once I got to that point. I was like, yeah, let's do it. But that turned out to be probably the most challenging trip both to do and to prepare for, because we decided we sort of brought it down to two choices. So we had a team of four. So a good friend of Kev's, Frank Wolf, was going to do it with us, and Dennis Barnett, a mate of mine from Dublin. So the four of us were all going to do it together. And Frank's a filmmaker, so we decided to make a documentary on this. And we said, well, we really shouldn't be able to do this. So wouldn't it be interesting to stop into some of the communities along the way, get their view on climate change?
Yeah.
Let's not tell, like, it's not our business. Oh, climate change, what do you think?
Yeah.
Just go, you tell us
that's great.
What life is like.
Because these people know, because they're like,
they've grown up on the land. They know the land.
I love it that you just said, it's like, it's okay. Let's not us decide what it is.
100%.
Ask the people who are there, because they kind of know.
They've seen the
their
changes.
Backyard.
It's their home. It's like if it's like if someone lived somewhere for 40, 50, 60, 70 years and someone else comes in and says, oh, so this is what's happened here. Well, no, just there's a reason. I think we've two ears and one mouth.
Yeah.
So we went in there and we just wanted to listen and hear from them. And it was fascinating just to, I mean, there was only 2 or 3 communities, because this is a couple of 1,000 kilometers of a trip. So there isn't a whole lot of, settlements up there.
Yeah.
So we got to speak with and learn from the Inuit people, and they just said, like, some of them would say, yeah, like when I grew up, these are elders who were maybe 60, 70, 80 years old. We're like, well, when we grew up, we didn't have water. It was choked up with ice year round, and that's affected for them, the type of animals you see up there. They're hunting, they're fishing. So it's really affected them, their way of life. So I mean, a simple example was one of the guys was telling us about pizzlies and growlers. So now you're getting grizzly bears moving further north because they wouldn't have gone up there in the past, and they're breeding with polar bears. So they were telling us, like, when you get a male polar and a female grizzly, they call it a pizzly. When it's a male grizzly and a female polar, they call it a growler. So it's just things like that, which seems sort of crazy in a way. So
polar bears are actually, they're grizzlies. They're very closely related to grizzlies.
I think they're
grizzlies who are ventured further north and
they adapted.
Listen, so the question is, like, overall, when you were talking to the indigenous people there, do they finding the life better now because the climate is warmer?
It's a tricky one. I mean, one of the things that I wasn't aware of until, and I was back up in the Arctic back in April, for a different trip. And I remember even before that one and before this one a couple of years ago, that like the Inuit and the Inuvialat, they like to roam the land. They like to travel on the land. Yeah. This is what I heard from people, that it's part of sort of who they are. And back in, I think it was the 1950s, the Canadian government were trying to corral people into communities. You have to come into communities, and they were treated quite badly. And at the moment, there is in Canada, there's sort of maybe an acknowledgement to a point about reconciliation, that there needs to be a reconciliation for all the stuff that happened back then. So I mean, I think for them, life it's a harsh way of living. I mean, they've grown up there, and when you're in these communities, they have maybe, they have 200, 300, 400 people. Where we finished up in Cambridge Bay was 1,500 people, which is quite big. So, I mean, for them, everything's very practical. Like, you know, can I fix my Skidoo if it breaks down?
Yeah.
Because if I can't, I could be stranded out here.
Mhm.
Yeah, and they, you know, an outfitter who I met in April, and he was telling me, he's like, I love being on the land. And I remember one night being out with him, he'd be showing me how they cut ice out of frozen rivers and stuff, and you know how you cut it depending on the cracks and stuff like that. And I think the land, it's a tough way of life for them, because I think now with, you know, with internet and the way the world is sort of opened up, the younger people are, you know, maybe they see what's outside of this community, and some of them will grow up and will want to leave and will want to get out, and they mightn't come back, and some do want to come back. And some of these communities are, you know, one of the communities in Baffin Island where I was, very high rate of suicide, and it's a, you know, if there isn't things to do, and if they haven't got much funding from maybe the government to provide services and stuff for young people, it's really challenging.
But is that rate of suicide, and this is a question that I may not know the answer, but I was wondering whether it is because of the opening up of the world and their life is generally changing. So then they're going into the, you know, like, oh, I would like this and that, where before, because I mean, like in the traditional way of living, if there was a high suicide rate, they probably wouldn't survive to the modern time. So is it like a more of a, like, they had to focus on their way of life before it was hard life and they were doing that, but they were happy. But now, because everything is easier with the access to technology, this is coming.
It's hard to know. I mean, I know obviously and I'm no expert on suicide by a long stretch of the imagination. There's different factors obviously they can contribute to it, and I know we stayed with this was in April. I stayed with a local in his home for a night when we finished the trip, and he was a retired nurse, so he does a lot of youth work up there in this town called Pengerton, and he was telling us with a lot of the teenage, because maybe, you know, their home situation might not be great, it might not be stable, there could be, you know, drink involved, and for a lot of these communities, they're dry communities, so they've chosen that, you know, there's no alcohol. Like you can have alcohol in your home, but I think from my understanding of it, it's a little bit like some of the Aboriginal people in Australia, they don't cope as well with alcohol. Their system. I think it's a physiological thing.
There's a hormone or some chemical in the body that some of these groups has just less. People in Asia, they have less, and that's why
the tolerance level, I think, is less. So I think it's not a great thing, you know, for them to have per se. So a lot of these communities, so if you take maybe not a great home situation, maybe if both parents aren't there or one is left, you know, for work or whatever, put in drink, put in boredom, put in potentially, I can see through the internet there's this stuff out here.
Exactly. That's what I'm,
you know, my schooling, you know, I'm getting to grade 12, but really the level of it's probably grade 8 or 9, and, you know, what use is this to me, because I'm going to be living off the land. So a lot of the stuff can go into that. So I suppose it gave me, when you go through some of these places, and it's interesting because the first Arctic trip, the rowing trip, like we pulled into a few places and like people were fascinated by, God, you're rowing through here, that's crazy. And again, I was just fascinated about, wow, you live up here. And, you know, like a real simple thing was, you know, a lot of them will have community freezers. So they literally will have these freezers in the permafrost where, you know, people will go out hunting and they'll come back and they'll store, like whether it's caribou, whether it's Arctic char. So they'll catch more, you know, for elders and stuff. Yeah. So there's an incredible sense of community up there in one way, which is amazing. And it's also it's a practical way of it's a harsh place to live.
I'm actually surprised that you're saying that there's a sense of community, but at the same time there's a high suicide rate. Well, there's a book by Sebastian Junger called The Tribe. I don't know if you heard about that book.
No.
I'll send you. It's a fascinating book where he actually says that how important for humans is this sense of the community overcoming adversity. And he gives example where the suicide rates are the highest when there are, you know, like a very expensive houses and gated communities, and like if everybody's like, you know, like a great living, there's high suicide rates, while in the neighborhoods where there's a poverty and people are kind of have to organize together just to survive, just to go through the day, actually the suicide rates are very low. And he kind of like, this is what I'm like, based on that, what I read is kind of surprising.
And I think as well is so when I talk about the community freezer, and the community where that was a place called Politok, which was higher up in the Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about, say, Pangerton, which was a different settlement.
Oh, okay.
So they were different. But having said that, I'm sure there's quite a lot of variables that go into it.
Oh, yes.
So
as usual, nothing is that simple.
Yeah, exactly. But it's definitely, I mean, it's amazing to, we only spent a few days in, say, Pangerton, where we finished the trip I did in April, whereas the rowing trip, say, through the Northwest Passage,
mm-hmm.
We were in Politok for one night after a month, just to sort of restock, and we needed to get another anchor, and so you get a tiny little snippet, into sort of what it's a little flavor, but it was just fascinating to see how they live and to see just their perspective. Again, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, even with the Australian cycle.
Mm-hmm.
You just get to see other people's views of the world, and I'm just curious by nature, I think. So you're it's like, wow, God, that's amazing. And so I think it is one of the nice things that, and that's why I said earlier with trips and stuff, I think there just needs to be, it's all, look, every person decides what they want to do, and each to their own, and some people will want to do a trip just to do it, and it's the physical challenge, and I'm similar in that respect. I suppose the "and" that I would put with that is, I think maybe as I get a bit older, I want it to mean something a bit more. So so I mean, and that trip was tough because we got 2 months into it, and we didn't get the whole way through the Northwest Passage, so the water was starting to, it was sort of early September, it was just starting to sort of slush, starting to freeze up again. So we had to make a call at Cambridge Bay to go, that's as far as we were going to get.
Right.
So it's tough like that. I mean, when you're
going to reattempt.
I'll see. I mean, we're looking at it. There's a lot of things involved in it, because I think with the benefit of hindsight, we went in a rowing boat, ocean rowing boat style. We can go 24 hours a day. We got thrashed around up there by weather. A lot of the winds that when we had touched base with some of the communities to get a feel in advance, go, what are the prevailing winds? And they're westerly. So we started to go west to east, but winds were really erratic. Some of the locals said to us, like, they're just, this year they seem to be all over the shop. And that's, I think now if we were going to go back to either try and finish it or potentially go back and try and do the whole thing in one go, it'd be a kayak trip. So I think it's
okay, you recalibrate and
I suppose again, look, you learn from your experience, and you sort of you do your best. I mean, like when we built the boat and we got, we had an awful lot went into that, and one of the things, like I remember, we were on a timeline, so because we knew we need to leave in late June, early July once the ice breaks up, everything works backwards from that. So we were on a timeline to get the boat built, and the whole trip was costing us probably about $250,000 Canadian dollars between all the gear and getting stuff up there, and everything goes into it. So we were putting our own money into it, but we got to a point that we were clear with the boat builder. Like he said, okay, I need to be paid in quarterly tranches. We said we'll pay you as we can, but we could very well get to tranche 2, have nothing left, and he was like, that's fine, you'll have a shell of a boat, but you just need to be aware of that. So we were, one of the things with some of these trips is you got to believe, I suppose, in yourself, or you got to back yourself to go, this is, and I remember talking to Kevin about this, I said, this is too good an overall trip for it not to happen. And I'll never forget sending a check one day. It was the last of the funds that we had to the boat builder. And as I posted, because he lived in Vancouver Island, and we were down to probably a month or two where it was like, right, we have to try this next year. And we did get a corporate partner on board eventually, but it was literally down to the wire. And that's sort of, company, an Irish company actually called Mainstream Renewable Power, and they build solar farms all over the world and wind farms. And that's one of the things with some of these trips. It's probably a little bit like starting your own business, that there's uncertainty, and you have to literally push the boat out and go, I don't know if this is even, it's a really weird thing, because you put everything into it, you commit to it, you start telling people about it. So you start sort of hanging yourself out there a bit. And in a way, I suppose that's needed, because if you don't do that, you know, you bring a bit of pressure on yourself to go, right, well, we're telling people about this. We built a website or whatever you've done. So it's a really tricky one, because you don't know unless you have, you know, in our case, we didn't have that money lying around to self-fund it. So it's, and that's the reality with a lot of these sort of expeditions. That's just part of it. So.
Great. Listen, Paul, tell us where they can find anything more about your trips, your adventures, because obviously there's much more, and we'll have to wrap it up. So for anyone interested for more.
I suppose, look, for anyone who wants more information, my company website is Turas Consulting. That's Turas is TURAS. So turrasconsulting.com. Turas is the Gaelic word for journey.
Right.
So when I set my company up a number of years ago, it really sort of, you know, we're all on our own journey in life, whatever that might be, and obviously I suppose I have an affinity for different types of adventure journeys.
Clearly.
So yeah, there's stuff on there, and I do a lot of collaboration work with Below the Line, which is where we're in our offices here. So there's information on Below the Line and Peak Teams, who are partners that I sort of work with as well. So
right,
it's all up there.
Plus the books on the
there's links there if people want to buy either the books. They're all up there as well. Yeah,
that's perfect. Paul, thank you very much for doing this. It was a pleasure.
No, my pleasure's mine. Thanks, Tommy.
Thank you.